Hello friends, and welcome to another episode of pianoTV. I am Allysia, your host, and right now I am not in my piano studio because it's cold in there, it is cold outside, and I am in my warm living room under like 5 layers of sweaters. Today I'm going to sit down and do a video that I can't believe I haven't done yet because I get asked about these books all the time. I'm going to talk about the Alfred adult method books today. We're going to go through them. I'm going to let you know what I think its pros and cons are, what the focus is. We're going to talk about each book and what they cover, and if I generally recommend them. And yeah, I get emails about this series all the time because it's probably one of the most popular piano method series of all time. And that one and Piano Adventures is really common, and I hear a lot about the John Thompson course, and I just recently picked those up, so I'll be able to talk about them soon. So what my plan is I'm going to talk about the Alfred series today, and then in the coming months I'll talk about a couple other method book series as well. Let me know in the comments if there's a series aside from John Thompson or Piano Adventures that you want me to take a look at. I know another old school one that I've flipped through is Bastion. I have some of their kid ones, so yeah, just let me know. But anyway, let's get to it. So the Alfred series as a whole has been around for a really long time. I grew up using these books when I was a kid. Not the adult ones, but like the regular lesson books. And I've also taught with them quite a few times. It's probably the book that I've taught the most from, actually. According to Alfred's website, the Alfred Music Publishing Company began way back in 1922 in New York City. And then it was just a publishing company then, but then in the 50s they started expanding and offering educational materials, and the company grew in popularity from there, pretty much exploding in popularity in the 70s and 80s. I'll give you a brief overview on how to go through the Alfred's basic adult piano course if you're a complete beginner, and then we're going to go into some of the finer details afterward. So here's an overview, what you see in front of you. It's just an overview of the standard path, okay? So you start with doing the 2 adult books. You do the adult course level 1 and then the adult course level 2, each one of them taking somewhere between 6 months to a year. It just depends on your motivation and stuff like that. Now, when you get to level 3, you have an option. You can use the 3rd adult book, or you can just dive into the main Alfred series. So you have an option. You do the adult level 3 or the basic level 3, and then there's level 4 and level 5. Now these correspond with different grade levels, and this is a rough correspondence. This isn't like an official recommendation or anything like that, but this is just kind of what I do in my studio, where level 3 matches up with grade 1, level 4 matches up with grade 2, and then level 5 matches up with grade 3, with the first 2 levels being music preparatory level. Both Alfred adult books are mainly focused on chords, and that's both the series' strength and its weakness at the same time. So the good thing about focusing on chords is that it allows you to jump into the music right away. Playing chords is usually something we let our left hands do, and it allows us to play pieces that sound more full and a little bit more song-like immediately. Whereas if we're learning in more of a classical style, there can be a steep learning curve as we figure out how to get our left hand a little bit more independent. And to be able to play a more independent left hand single note style with a regular right hand melody takes a while before it starts sounding like real music. Whereas you'll see this in old school method books by people like Bartok from the turn of the century with Microcosmos. It doesn't really sound like real music, let's just say. But with the chord-based method books, which you will see quite a lot of these, it allows you to dive into the material. And one other benefit too is if you're interested in more of getting into contemporary music, learning how to play chords is absolutely crucial for playing any kind of contemporary music. And I would argue it's absolutely crucial for learning classical music too. So chord-based approaches are great. They allow you to start playing music that sounds like real music a little bit sooner. It's easier to play, so if you have a really tough time with left-hand coordination and stuff like that, it's gonna get you playing music more easily. But that is the other side of the coin. It's flawed because with chord-based approaches, we're taking a little bit of the easy path with our left hand, both in terms of reading notes, because reading chords in the left hand becomes very repetitive. You get really used to seeing those patterns in the left hand. Whereas if you're reading classical music, you kind of have to, your reading of the right hand and the left hand has to be on high alert at all times because the notes are just a little bit more random. They jump. They don't necessarily follow like the exact same shapes and patterns, where chords, you can kind of glance at the bass clef and be like, oh, I know what's going on here. Like once you've played a lot of chords, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So it's not great for developing your left hand coordination and your left hand note reading and independence. So that would be the weakness. But It kind of depends. Like if you're really, really wanting to go in a classical music direction only, then this might not be the method for you. But if you're interested in pop, or maybe like a little bit more focused on pop with some classical, then this is going to be a good choice. Since the Alfred books tend to be chord focused, they're just naturally more pop focused. And that's what you're going to see with your song selection when you are playing through this. You're going to see songs like Happy Birthday, When the Saints Go Marching In, The Entertainer, Amazing Grace, and other pieces kind of in that realm. The second Alfred book does have a little bit more diversity in terms of it's not just like a whole bunch of standards and folk songs and stuff like that. There are more classical pieces like Brahms' Lullaby, to Canon in D, to La Cucaracha, and then there's also original pieces as well. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at each book individually and go a bit more in depth on what you'll learn in them. So the first Alfred book is the one that I've been using since I started teaching. And since I've used it so many times and I used it for so many years, it definitely has like a really fond place in my heart. One thing you'll immediately notice when you crack the cover of this book is that there's a big list of books that you can use in conjunction with this one. Everything from all-time favorites to Christmas to country and so on. And one thing that I think is really cool about this is it tells you what page it corresponds with. So for example, if you're learning if you're going through this adult book and you're interested in playing some of the sacred music from the sacred book, it tells you can start the sacred book on page 27. So by the time you reach page 27 of this method book, you're going to be ready to try the sacred book. So I think that's a really cool function. It takes out a lot of the guesswork, especially for someone who's learning without a teacher. In the first Alfred Adult Method book, there are 12 chapters and an introduction, and about 63 pieces, in addition to a variety of exercises and lessons. So what this means is that you'll be completing about 1 to 2 pieces per week if you are planning on finishing the first book in a year. And the first book is 112 pages long, it's fairly long. The first 2 books are at a preparatory level, which I affectionately like to refer to as musical kindergarten. It basically just means that you have to get through these books and learn all the basics before you are able to be at a grade 1 level or a grade 2 level. And that surprises a lot of students. A lot of people think that they can just kind of jump into grade 1, but you really need to lay the groundwork with your kindergarten. The way everything equates is the first adult book I tend to equate with preparatory level A, and that's an RCM classification. They divide preparatory, so music kindergarten, into 2 grades, which is good because it usually takes people a couple years to do kindergarten. So I should actually just call it preparatory, but I'm used to calling it kindergarten. So yeah, the first book would be equivalent to preparatory A, and the second book would be equivalent to preparatory B, and then once you finish the second book, you could officially call yourself grade 1, or starting grade 1. Here are some of the topics that you're going to be covering in the first book. You're going to be talking about basic key signatures, so that would be C, G, and F major, and a couple minor ones as well. There's a big part of it devoted to how to play chords, and mainly chords in different keys. So you'll have chords in C, G, and F major, but there's also some minor chords in there too. You have basic rhythm patterns all the way through 8th notes, dotted quarter notes, and even really basic syncopation. It gets much more into rhythm in the second book, but that's a pretty good starting point for most people. There's damper pedal in it, and then all the basics of note reading. So you're going to see how to actually read the notes on the staff, time signatures, dynamic, sharps, flats, all those things that you come across when you're looking at a piece of sheet music. The difficulty level of the first adult book follows a little bit of an interesting path. Like, I find it fairly simple and easy when you're starting for probably I think the first 40 pages or so, but towards the middle, there tends to be a little bit of a hitch at the end of the G position section with the specific pieces of Beautiful Brown Eyes and Alpine Melody. Now, there's just something about these pieces. People tend to get stuck here. So if you've been through the adult books, maybe you've experienced this yourself before too. But what I think what it is with Beautiful Brown Eyes, you have to learn a new chord, and you have to play in 3/4 time, and you have to try out this new left-hand pattern, like the bottom top pattern. So it's kind of like a whole triple whammy of things. And then Alpine Melody is similar, but it's just a little bit harder in its own way. But once you get past that little mountain, it gets easier again until we get to pretty much, I think it's around page 80 or so with Go Down Moses. And just randomly, it just gets really hard. And what I find happens with my students is we usually actually just skip the last 20 pages of the book or so, because around page 100, which is Singing in the Rain, it's almost like people's attention spans for the book just kind of die. And it's a real slog getting through those last pieces. Like, I don't know what this is, and again, I'd be interested to know if you've, like, we experience this in my studio with almost every student who goes through it. People are just by that point, like, ready to get into the new stuff, which I'm usually fine with because the second book has a really big introduction review of the first book. So I don't think it's a real loss. Another thing I want to talk to you guys about with these books and future books is the hokiness factor. Now, a reality of learning piano from scratch right from the beginning is the music is going to be a little bit hokey. It just is. I mean, it's practically a rite of passage for people to learn Mary Had a Little Lamb on the piano, but it could also be a little bit dispiriting when you're an adult wanting to play like actual serious music and you're like, do, 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 do. So I understand, and that's why I wanted to talk about the hokiness. So there aren't a lot of like really what I would call serious pieces in the first book, which might be disappointing to some. We do have a few good ones, like there's Amazing Grace, Over the Rainbow. Like those are always really classy, but they're not until the very end. I actually think the first cool piece that we come across in this one is Jericho. It's like a minor key. It's got a good rhythm. People tend to enjoy playing. But again, it doesn't appear until chapter 11, until page 81. So it's really, really late in the book. So here's how I usually think about this. Like a beginner at the piano usually has a ton of fire and zest and enthusiasm. And that enthusiasm powers them through all that cheesy music. And then usually once they start losing that motivation, they're at a point where they can start playing like slightly less cheesy music, which will kind of reignite the fire. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. It's like if you're enthusiastic enough, you will find the educational value in those cheesy pieces, and that will be enough to move you forward. So when the hokey thing becomes a problem and it's not enough and you want to learn like more serious pieces, but you're still halfway through the Alfred book, one thing that I do with my students is introduce them stuff from, say, the RCM Preparatory A book, or even the B, Preparatory B book, just from other sources, to learn like some so-called more serious pieces. Because not only do these pieces look more serious and sound more serious, they take 2 to 3 times as long to learn usually. And that, since the serious pieces are so much more of a challenge, they can then go and make the cheesy method book music more appealing in its own way because it's simpler. So you can kind of get like a fondness for it like that. As with the first book, the level 2 book comes with corresponding books if you'd like to stay within the Alfred family, but not necessarily be limited to everything that's just in the lesson book. So you have things like the All-Time Favorites 2, Pop Song Book 2, Sacred Book 2, Theory, Greatest Hits, etc. The second Alfred book has 15 chapters, and some of them are really small. And this includes an extensive review section, like I mentioned, as the first chapter. The book as a whole has 42 pieces, so quite a bit less. You're basically learning about 1 piece a week if you want to finish the whole thing in a year. There's also an appendix of references, which is handy. That includes the circle of fifths, chord charts, and scale charts. This book is 96 pages long, including the appendix, and because of that, it's leaner than the first one. But I actually find this leanness to be an advantage because students can usually complete this book without getting tired of it, unlike the first book. Many of the chapters in Alfred's piano course books are geared around different keys and hand positions, but there is also some variation in the second book. We see a little bit of a break from the chord-based approach with some pieces. There's like a quick lesson in 2-part writing midway through, like a classical music style, and there are some other classical styles integrated in there as well. A list of some of the other topics that you'll come across include various key signatures like D, B flat, and E flat major. There's new rhythms. You're doing 16th notes, dotted 8th notes. It gets a little bit more complex, especially with the syncopation too. You're looking at chromatic scales. There's more on chords like 7th chords, how to invert chords, augmented and diminished chords. There's lots of chord stuff in this one, which again, it's a chord-based approach, so that's what you'd expect. And there's new chord patterns to try out. There are another just like basic note reading stuff like classical tempo markings, stuff like andante, allegro, that kind of thing. There's a little lesson in trills near the end and things like that. So as far as the difficulty level goes, and I find this to be true of most method books that focus on chords, the note reading is pretty easy because, as we talked about, you're able to start recognizing patterns in the left-hand chords and stuff like that. But when you're learning pop music, the rhythms can be more complicated than learning similar leveled classical pieces, where beginner level classical pieces tend to have very, very simple rhythms. So that's one thing that I find is the rhythm reading in this book is going to be quite a bit more challenging for, I have a lot of students who really struggle with a few of the pieces in here with the rhythm. There are still going to be a lot of straightforward pieces as well, so it's not all going to be like crazy challenge, weird rhythm ones. There's ones like You're in My Heart that has a really simple rhythm, and so on. One piece that's kind of a surprising challenge, this one's standing out to me. I don't want to talk too much about all the pieces in this book, but Hokey Pokey. A lot of my students tend to think that since they know the tune and it's like a pretty simple, familiar tune, they think it'll be an easy piece. But those three note right hand chords are really tough for most learners, which is why this tends to be a sticking piece for people. But overall, I find the second book to be quite a bit more challenging than the first book. I mean, that's kind of an obvious statement. It's supposed to be more challenging. But I want to just have a little mini tangent here about that, because I find that this is the point where most people are going to quit, if they're going to quit. It's in the second book of any method book. It doesn't have to be Alfred, because you're not yet at the level where you're playing like these fancy, sophisticated pieces, but you're past that kind of beginner adrenaline rush. So it's easy to slog through the second book and feel like, oh, I'm going to be doing these cheesy songs forever. Like, I'm not good. Like, that's where we start to get a lot of this negative self-talk. But I promise you, my friend, if you power through that second book, the third book often feels a lot easier by comparison, just because it's not easier, but you start playing more real music and you're used to new challenges all the time. You're used to piano practice being a bit of a struggle and stuff like that. So I find like the second book can be a little bit of a low point for people, and I just wanted to throw that out there. I want to briefly mention too that there is a third adult book in the series, but the reason that I'm not going to talk about it today is because I don't have it, I don't own it, and I've never taught with it. I'm sure it's a great book. The first two have set a precedent, so I'm sure the third one is also great. The reason I don't use it is because I usually transition students into the regular lesson series for the third book. So, in this book, there's going to be some like childish images and stuff like that. So if that's something that offends you or makes you feel like you're not a serious piano player, then keep using the adult series until book 3, and then transition to book 4 to like the kind of main series. But if it doesn't bother you, you can transition to book 3 as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about all this, would I recommend this series to you? And yeah, absolutely, I would recommend it. Not only have I used it more than any other method book that I've taught from, I also just like it's reputable, it's trustworthy. A lot of people have used it. I've personally seen people have success in learning piano using this as their foundation. It's a solid course. You really can't go wrong with it. It's easily accessible, it's pretty affordable, and like we talked about earlier, there's all those supplemental books. So if you're wanting to explore but you have no idea what to learn and there's like so much music everywhere and you don't know what to pick, then you can rest assured knowing that they've taken a lot of the guesswork out for you. So if you're interested in country music or rock music or like standards or anything like that, you can use those supplemental books and know that they're going to be at the correct level and that you're not going to be overdoing it or picking pieces that are way too tough for things like that. I want to say this all with a caveat though, is I do use the Piano Adventures adult books now instead. And they're really similar in a lot of ways, but I find that Piano Adventures has the edge in the hokiness factor. I find the books just less hokey as a whole. And also that they're a little bit more middle of the road for if you want to learn classical or pop. They are chord focused still. Like, so you learn chords in the Piano Adventures book, but you're not, it's pretty balanced with learning like classical style writing with single notes in the left hand, and you have to move hand positions a lot and stuff like that. So it forces you to read the notes a little bit more than the Alfred books, which are more position based. You kind of plunk your hands down in a position, and then, when we do that, we start relying on finger numbers and using finger numbers to read instead. So that's the edge that I think Piano Adventures has. But that being said, I think like they're close enough that it can really just come down to personal preference, or whatever your teacher likes too. My rating for this series, if I were to give it one, would be A-, and then I would give the Piano Adventures an A. I haven't come across a method book that I've considered perfect in every way, like an A+. So I am kind of curious to start exploring more method books and see if there is like that mythical A+ book out there. Let me know if you have a favorite that I haven't talked about, and I'd love to look through and explore more of these. If you guys want to see more videos like this, be sure to give it a thumbs up. You can subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye guys. One thing you'll notice. I was being Mario. I wasn't being racist. It's me, Mario.